Today we're shifting perspective a bit. In the previous chapters, we focused on learning itself, what formal learning is, what students bring with them, and what actually has to happen for learning to occur. Now we turn that around and ask a different question. If that is how learning works, what does that mean for teaching? Instead of starting from methods or techniques, this chapter starts from an understanding of the learner. The central idea is that teachers cannot directly cause learning. What we can do is design the conditions, activities, and environments that make learning possible. So today's lecture is about designing for learning, how research on learning can be translated into concrete principles for teaching practice. The previous 3 chapters examined formal learning from different perspectives. First, we clarified how formal learning differs from other types of learning. Second, we explored what students bring with them into the learning process. Third, we analyzed what it actually takes to learn within formal education. Together, these chapters draw on both empirical research and conceptual studies. Although the field is extensive, focusing on key texts and identifying common patterns across studies gives us a solid foundation. This foundation allows us to move toward a principled and research-informed approach to designing teaching and learning processes. Figure 5.1 is structured as 2 interacting systems. The teacher's design logic on the left and the student's learning logic on the right. The diagram makes visible that teaching is never designed in isolation. It is shaped by both institutional constraints and learner characteristics. On the teacher side, design begins at the top with credits, qualification level, and formal requirements. These define what is structurally possible. The teacher's own motivations and pedagogical orientations also feed into the construction of course aims. From these aims flow the intended learning outcomes and selected topics. Only then does the teacher design teaching activities and assessment. Logistics influence delivery, but the intellectual design is driven primarily by aims and outcomes. On the student side, learners enter with motivations, expectations, prior knowledge, and skills. These shape their personal goals and perceived needs. These, in turn, influence how they engage in learning activities and how they interpret assessment demands. The diagram makes explicit that learning activities are not mechanically produced by teaching, they are mediated by the learner's internal framework. At the center, teaching activities and learning activities are coupled in an iterative exchange. At the bottom, actual learning outcomes feed back not only into judgments about students, but into evaluation of teaching, assessment, and even curriculum aims. The outer loop therefore represents curriculum review, while the inner loop represents ongoing pedagogical adjustment. Figure 5.1 thus presents teaching as a dynamic, constrained, and iterative design system, where alignment must occur not just between outcomes, activities, and assessment, but between teacher intentions and learner goals. A central challenge is that the instructional design literature is vast and fragmented. Major edited volumes present dozens of different models and hundreds of guidelines. While this is often celebrated as a rich array of approaches, it creates difficulty for practicing teachers who need clarity rather than abundance. Across influential handbooks and collections, there is surprisingly little overlap in theoretical foundations. Different authors draw on different theorists, and few are consistently referenced. The result is a field that appears diverse but lacks integration. From a teacher's perspective, this can feel less like richness and more like disarray. There have been strong calls for greater synergy across disciplines such as cognitive neuroscience, informal learning research, and educational psychology. Scholars argue that these perspectives should complement one another rather than compete. Vygotsky often appears as a shared source of inspiration across different traditions. However, even where there is overlap in references, there is still no comprehensive synthesis that integrates these insights into instructional design. As Entwistle and Smith observe, teachers are presented with multiple principles that claim to improve learning, yet these principles often seem contradictory or detached from classroom realities. Despite the fragmentation in the literature, developing principled guidelines is essential. Without them, we lack a coherent basis for evaluating both conventional and digital teaching methods, something that is increasingly important in contemporary education. Chapter 4 described learning as a series of iterative cycles. changes within the learner and interactions between learner, teacher, and environment. If we take that model seriously, it implies specific responsibilities for the teacher. These include aligning teacher and learner goals, setting tasks that build on available concepts, clarifying conceptual structures, designing appropriate practice environments, monitoring student understanding, and ensuring meaningful feedback. The remainder of the chapter examines how the instructional design literature attempts to address these roles. The principle of alignment is an important foundation for teaching design, but it does not fully address learner readiness. Effective teaching must operate within the learner's zone of proximal development, meaning that the concepts and actions required by a task must be accessible to the student. Curriculum design, therefore, becomes an exercise in sequencing concepts and skills in ways that build progressively on what students can already do. This is far from straightforward. We often lack reliable knowledge about which concepts are especially difficult, or what specific prior knowledge is necessary at each stage. At the same time, students arrive with widely differing levels of preparation, including misconceptions that may undermine new learning. Without diagnosing this starting point, teaching risks building on unstable foundations. Discovering what students already know is therefore essential for meaningful progression. Educational research consistently emphasizes that teachers must draw out and work with students' prior conceptions. Learning is not a simple transfer of information. Students interpret new ideas through the lens of what they already believe and understand. This requires active inquiry into student thinking. Teachers need to create tasks and conditions that make thinking visible, often through frequent formative assessment. Feedback should help students refine and reorganize their ideas rather than simply correct isolated errors. Importantly, assessment should focus on conceptual understanding, not just factual recall. Effective teaching, therefore, depends on recognizing students' perceptions and deliberately designing conditions that support conceptual change. However, focusing only on prior conceptions is insufficient. Teaching itself can generate new misunderstandings. Students may interpret explanations, tasks, or examples in unintended ways. For this reason, teachers must continuously monitor learners' articulations and interpretations throughout the learning process. Research using phenomenography has shown that students conceptualize the same topic in qualitatively different ways, and these differences strongly influence learning outcomes. This means that teachers must attend not only to what students knew at the beginning, but also to the alternative conceptions that emerge during instruction. Monitoring alternative conceptions, not just eliciting prior ones, becomes a central teaching responsibility. Chapter 4 emphasizes that learners need a structured practice environment where they can translate concepts into action. Learning develops when students act, evaluate their performance, and use the results to refine both their practice and their understanding. This creates demanding requirements for the teacher. First, complex actions must be modeled and deconstructed so that tasks fall within the learner's zone of proximal development. This is the essence of scaffolding, simplifying tasks so students can manage components of the process and recognize when they are achieving alignment with the goal. Second, learners require sufficient deliberate practice. Time on task matters, especially when concepts are complex or unfamiliar. Expertise develops through repeated, goal-oriented practice. Third, practice must include meaningful feedback. Without feedback, practice risks reinforcing ineffective approaches. Deliberate practice depends on feedback that highlights discrepancies between the learner's current performance and an ideal model. This often takes the form of extrinsic feedback from a teacher or coach, who marks critical features and demonstrates improved performance. However, support must gradually fade. If the teacher overdirects the improvement process, the learner does not develop the ability to interpret feedback independently. Traditional educational tasks often lack intrinsic feedback from the environment itself. Students completing essays or problem-solving exercises do not automatically see the consequences of their actions. As a result, they rely heavily on external guidance. An ideal practice environment would provide carefully calibrated tasks within the learner's zone of proximal development and offer intrinsic formative feedback that supports independent improvement. Yet in mass education systems, providing timely and detailed feedback for every student remains a significant logistical challenge. Although practice-based environments support deep understanding, teaching often relies on lectures, texts, and representations because they are more efficient in terms of teacher time. However, fostering conceptual change requires more than clear explanation. Educational research emphasizes the importance of identifying students' prior conceptions, particularly around threshold concepts, those foundational yet troublesome ideas that are complex, counterintuitive, or in conflict with everyday assumptions. To support meaningful change, the teacher must understand the relationship between the learner's existing conceptual structure and the intended disciplinary structure. Teaching must then be designed to move students systematically from one to the other. Two key strategies for conceptual change are bridging and cognitive conflict. Bridging uses intermediate analogies, moving from familiar situations to more advanced or abstract ones governed by the same principle. This helps students discern conceptual similarities across contexts. Cognitive conflict, by contrast, deliberately challenges misconceptions. Through strategies such as predict, observe, explain, students make predictions based on their current understanding, confront unexpected outcomes, and are prompted to revise their conceptual structure. Both approaches recreate a goal-action feedback cycle within teacher-student dialogue. The architecture of variation focuses on how concepts are structured and how learners experience contrast. Students can only discern a concept if they encounter systematic variation. Without contrast, structure remains invisible. The teacher must design sequences of examples that highlight critical differences and relationships. When this design is successful, the learning environment functions like a language-based microworld. Students use their current understanding to make predictions, receive feedback, and refine their thinking. Conceptual change then becomes an iterative spiral, where each cycle of explanation and refinement strengthens the learner's conceptual structure. Throughout this discussion, reflection has been central to the learner's activity. In the model of the learner learning, reflection is what allows students to modulate their conceptual organization, goals, and repertoire of actions in response to feedback from the environment or from the teacher. Without this modulation, there is no learning, yet reflection is internally generated. The learner must perform it, the teacher cannot directly observe it. At best, teachers infer its presence from students' actions and articulations. This makes metacognition both essential and pedagogically elusive. Reflection becomes metacognition when the learner does more than adjust after failure. It involves stepping back from an action to consider the knowledge structure that produced it, its alignment with intended goals, and its effectiveness. It is cognition about cognition, an explicit monitoring and regulation of one's own learning process. Educational theorists consistently argue that metacognitive skills must be deliberately cultivated. A metacognitive approach to instruction helps students define their learning goals and monitor progress toward them. In this sense, learning becomes something students actively manage rather than passively receive. The teacher's role is therefore to elicit these capacities through encouragement, modeling, and structured opportunities for articulation. Group discussion is particularly powerful. When students explain not only what they think but how they approached a task, they externalize mental processes that are otherwise hidden. Concrete design patterns are especially valuable here. For example, structured turn-taking in discussing comprehension strategies, modeling planning processes for writing, and scaffolding peer explanation all make metacognitive processes visible. Such patterns operationalize abstract principles. They translate, encourage metacognition into observable pedagogic moves. This illustrates a recurring dilemma in educational design. General principles are necessary for coherence, but specific patterns provide practical guidance. The craft of teaching lies in navigating that balance. There is broad agreement that our understanding of learning should inform how we design teaching. The logic seems straightforward. If we know how learning works, we should be able to design for it. Yet the relationship between learning theory and teaching practice remains problematic. Educational research typically investigates specific teaching-learning situations aimed at particular outcomes. When these findings are generalized, they often become abstract principles, such as students must engage or reduce didactic teaching. The problem is not that these principles are wrong, but that they are underspecified. They rarely tell us how to enact them in particular disciplinary contexts. As a result, they either appear obvious or too generic to guide real design decisions. This is why teaching cannot be treated as an exact science. Learning environments are complex, uncertain, and non-deterministic. The implication, as Bransford and colleagues argue, is that teachers must themselves be learners. Teaching is better understood as a design science, closer to engineering than to physics. As Herbert Simon argued, design is the activity of devising courses of action aimed at transforming existing situations into desired ones. Teaching, therefore, requires both research-informed principles and practitioner-developed heuristics. It is principled, but not mechanical. If teaching is a design science, then teachers must engage in iterative, evidence-informed improvement. Ferenc Martin argues that because each curriculum topic has its own architecture of variation, teachers must discover how conceptual understanding unfolds in that specific domain. This cannot be imported wholesale from general theory. Martin proposes the learning study as a structured design experiment. The process includes defining objectives in terms of capabilities and values, designing teaching informed by prior experience and research, implementing the plan, evaluating student achievement, and documenting and sharing lessons learned. The final step is crucial. It situates teachers within a professional learning community rather than as isolated practitioners. Similarly, Charles Rigeleth advocates design-based research focused on improvement rather than comparison. The aim is formative inquiry that enhances the effectiveness, efficiency, and appeal of instruction. Knowledge emerges not only as theory, but embedded in improved designs and generalizable principles. To treat teaching this way would be a significant cultural shift. As Derek Bach observes, universities readily apply research to improve every domain except their own teaching. A genuine design-based approach would demand rigor, collaboration, and systematic inquiry from teachers themselves. What then does a principled design approach look like in practice? The framework summarized here translates research into structured design principles rather than vague exhortations. First, alignment. Goals, activities, and assessment must cohere. Assessments should test deep conceptual understanding, not isolated facts, and should align with both teacher and learner goals. Second, monitoring alternative conceptions. Teachers must actively inquire into student thinking, make preconceptions visible, and use formative assessment to surface misunderstandings. Third, scaffolding theory-based practice. Tasks should be structured within the learner's zone of proximal development, simplified where necessary, and supported with feedback and modeling. Learners need opportunities to externalize and revise their thinking. Fourth, fostering conceptual development. Through carefully designed variation, contrasting examples, and structured discourse, students discern the underlying structure of concepts. Finally, encouraging metacognition. Students must practice reflection on both content and learning processes, including peer discussion and self-assessment. These principles move beyond slogans. They define actionable roles for teachers operating within a design science framework. What then does a principled design approach look like in practice? The framework summarized here translates research into structured design principles rather than vague exhortations. First, alignment. Goals, activities, and assessment must cohere. Assessments should test deep conceptual understanding, not isolated facts, and should align with both teacher and learner goals. Second, monitoring alternative conceptions. Teachers must actively inquire into student thinking, make preconceptions visible, and use formative assessment to surface misunderstandings. Third, scaffolding theory-based practice. Tasks should be structured within the learner's zone of proximal development, simplified where necessary, and supported with feedback and modeling. Learners need opportunities to externalize and revise their thinking. Fourth, fostering conceptual development. Through carefully designed variation, contrasting examples, and structured discourse, students discern the underlying structure of concepts. Finally, encouraging metacognition. Students must practice reflection on both content and learning processes, including peer discussion and self-assessment. These principles move beyond slogans. They define actionable roles for teachers operating within a design science framework. Table 5.1 distills the literature into design guidelines for teachers. Yet across theoretical traditions, there is agreement on a crucial point. Because learning and its context are irreducibly complex, teaching cannot be reduced to fixed prescriptions. No universal formula can guarantee learning. Instead, teaching must itself be understood as a learning process. In design science terms, teachers engage in progressive refinement, an ongoing cycle of designing, enacting, evaluating, and improving practice. Improvement is not achieved by applying static rules, but by iteratively testing principles in context. The learning activities identified in Chapter 4, conceptual engagement, practice, feedback, reflection, are broadly supported by educational design theory. Recent work further emphasizes peer interaction as a means of scaffolding learning. However, a recurring problem remains. Research-generated guidelines often become so generic that they offer little concrete direction for teachers working within specific disciplines. The challenge, then, is not simply to collect principles, but to transform them into a principled approach that meaningfully connects theory, subject-specific pedagogy, and classroom experimentation. Table 5.1 distills the literature into design guidelines for teachers. Yet across theoretical traditions, there is agreement on a crucial point. Because learning and its context are irreducibly complex, teaching cannot be reduced to fixed prescriptions. No universal formula can guarantee learning. Instead, teaching must itself be understood as a learning process. In design science terms, teachers engage in progressive refinement, an ongoing cycle of designing, enacting, evaluating, and improving practice. Improvement is not achieved by applying static rules, but by iteratively testing principles in context. The learning activities identified in Chapter 4, conceptual engagement, practice, feedback, reflection, are broadly supported by educational design theory. Recent work further emphasizes peer interaction as a means of scaffolding learning. However, a recurring problem remains. Research-generated guidelines often become so generic that they offer little concrete direction for teachers working within specific disciplines. The challenge, then, is not simply to collect principles, but to transform them into a principled approach that meaningfully connects theory, subject-specific pedagogy, and classroom experimentation.